What happens when the poorest country in Europe looks the most powerful man in Russia straight in the eye and simply says no? That's exactly what's happening in Moldova right now, and Vladimir Putin never saw it coming. Before we get into how this unfolded, hit that like button, subscribe so you catch every update on this story, and share this with someone who needs to understand why this tiny country matters so much more than its size suggests. Moldova is one of the poorest, smallest, and most fragile countries in Eastern Europe. It has no access to the sea, no significant underground resources, and it inherited the broken remains of a Soviet economy that never really recovered. On paper, these economic and geographic disadvantages might have eventually been overcome with time. But Moldova faced something far bigger than bad geography. Vladimir Putin had spent decades treating this small country as the natural backyard of his empire, and he did everything imaginable to keep it that way. He illegally stationed soldiers in the eastern part of the country, in a region called Transnistria. He threatened an entire nation with cold and darkness, suddenly shutting off gas supplies during the harshest winter months. According to official intelligence reports, he funneled more than $1 million in dark money into Moldova during a single election cycle alone, specifically to destabilize the country and buy votes. But the Kremlin's calculations on paper never matched what was actually happening on the streets of Chisinau. Moldovans wanted out of this endless cycle of blackmail entirely. They turned their faces away from the cold oligarchy to the east and toward Europe instead. Moldova's president, Maia Sandu, had said this openly months earlier. Moldovans want to be EU citizens, not Russian citizens. And on June 15th, those words turned into a concrete, formal process. The European Union officially launched accession negotiations with Moldova during an intergovernmental conference in Luxembourg. On that exact same day, negotiations opened with Ukraine as well. Two countries sitting side by side at the EU negotiating table offered the clearest possible picture of Russia's shrinking sphere of influence across Eastern Europe. In this first phase, 5 critical negotiating chapters were opened, covering exactly the areas where the EU will scrutinize Moldova most closely, from judicial independence to the fight against corruption. The EU's Enlargement Commissioner, Marta Koss, described Moldova as one of the best-performing candidate countries and expects the remaining chapters to open before the end of summer. The goal is ambitious but concrete: full readiness for EU membership by 2030. Reaching this point wasn't easy at all. Hungary's former Prime Minister Viktor Orban had spent years blocking the EU accession process for both Ukraine and Moldova, acting as the Kremlin's most useful ally inside the European Union. In April 2026, Orban lost his election. His successor lifted that veto in exchange for an offer from Brussels to unfreeze 16 billion euros in previously blocked funds. Russia's strongest obstacle inside the EU disappeared virtually overnight, and Moldova's path forward finally cleared. So why does Moldova need this path so badly? The answer hides in a single word: survival. Moldova is the poorest country in Europe. Income per capita sits around $8,000, less than a fifth of the EU average. The economy still depends heavily on agriculture and remittances sent home by Moldovans living abroad. 15% of household income comes directly from money sent back by citizens working overseas, and the people who leave rarely come back. Between 1 and 1.2 million citizens have left the country over the past 30 years, a number equal to roughly a quarter of the entire working-age population. Educated young people keep leaving. 20% of businesses report labor shortages, and the tax base keeps eroding as a result. Analysts have started describing Moldova as a vanishing country. The demographic crisis feeds the economic crisis, and the cycle seems impossible to break. President Sandu doesn't hide this reality either. She's said openly that it's becoming increasingly difficult for a small country like Moldova to survive as a democracy while resisting Russian pressure. Becoming part of the EU, in her words, is Moldova's democratic survival strategy. These aren't just words for public consumption. Sandu is simultaneously managing the poorest country in Europe, resisting sustained Russian pressure, and pushing through genuine EU-style reforms all at once. EU membership represents the only realistic way to break this cycle. Structural funds would attract real investment. Free movement within the EU would give the diaspora genuine motivation to return home, and access to the EU market would finally make industrial development possible. The EU is already providing Moldova with a support package worth 1.9 billion euros over 3 years, but full membership would make this kind of support permanent and institutionally guaranteed. There's another reason Moldova needs the EU so badly, and it's tied to its own troubled past. Back in 2014, Moldovan politicians stole roughly $1 billion from the country's banking system, a single fraud that made 12% of GDP simply vanish overnight. The architect of that theft, Elon Shor, now lives in Moscow and works directly for the Kremlin. The era of oligarch Vlad Plahotnius rotted Moldova's institutions from the inside out. The EU accession process gives Moldova an external framework to finally clean up this legacy. Independent courts, transparent public procurement, accountable governance. These reforms are the EU. Moldova remains permanently trapped as a playground for oligarchs and the Kremlin. Moldova refused to accept that fate, and it broke its first chain on the energy front. Russia shut off gas supplies in the middle of winter in 2025, hoping to bring Moldova to its knees. Instead of kneeling, Moldova switched to European alternatives and reduced its dependence on Russian gas down to zero. Russia's direct economic impact on Moldova has since fallen to just 2.2%. The Kremlin no longer holds real leverage, and public opinion has moved firmly in the same direction. Support for EU integration currently sits between 60 and 70%. For young people in the middle class, the EU represents free movement, structural funding, and a genuinely better standard of living. Nothing Russia can offer comes close to competing with that. Moldova isn't walking this path alone either. Romania isn't just Moldova's neighbor, it's its closest relative and strongest supporter. The bond between these two countries runs far deeper than a simple alliance. Moldova reached its current borders in 1940 through Soviet occupation. Before that, the region known as Bessarabia was actually part of Romania from 1918 until 1940. They speak the same language. They share the same cultural codes. And this connection doesn't just exist on paper. Out of roughly 2.4 million Moldovan citizens, about 1 million also hold Romanian citizenship, including President Sandu herself. Romania has been an EU member since 2007 and is actively passing that experience along as a mentor throughout Moldova's accession process. Joint infrastructure projects, energy integration, and defense cooperation between the two countries are moving forward without any delay. According to some observers, the depth and speed of this cooperation goes well beyond what you'd normally expect between neighboring states. Many analysts argue that unification between the two countries has, in practical terms, already quietly begun. Passports, economic integration, and cultural closeness keep advancing without waiting for any official political decision. Sandu took a genuinely unexpected step in January 2026, announcing she would vote in favor of a unification referendum with Romania if one were held, calling it Plan B. EU membership remains the primary goal, but if that process stalls, unification with Romania could offer an alternative solution to Moldova's security and economic challenges. Public opinion polling shows the wind shifting. Support for unification is rising in both countries, crossing 50% once the diaspora populations are included in the count. Romania's president, Nicos Ordan, put it simply, "We're ready if the Moldovan people want it, but we're not quite there yet." Romania is ready. The Moldovan people are ready. The Kremlin, understandably, wasn't willing to accept this picture, and it used every tool available to try changing it. Elin Shor, mentioned earlier, became the public face of Kremlin operations inside Moldova. Ahead of the 2024 elections, Shor's network ran a systematic vote-buying campaign. At the same time, AI-powered disinformation campaigns flooded social media platforms. Russian-controlled television channels broadcast directly into Moldovan homes, pushing Kremlin narratives relentlessly, until Moldova's government began blocking these channels outright. An investigation published by Novaya Gazeta Europe in June 2026 revealed exactly where the money behind these operations came from. More than $1 million in credit was transferred to companies financing Shor's various projects, routed through structures controlled by former Chelsea owner Roman Abramovich. Additional credit came from companies linked to Arkady Rotenberg, one of Putin's childhood friends. This financing network used international payment mechanisms routed through Kyrgyzstan specifically to bypass sanctions. And among the clients using these same mechanisms were sanctioned Russian companies that manufactured drones used in the war against Ukraine. Russia has also kept up pressure on the diplomatic front. Russia's ambassador in Chisinau, Oleg Ozerov, publicly questioned Moldova's constitutional neutrality, claiming Ukrainian military transport planes were regularly landing at Marculesti airfield inside Moldova. Russia used this claim specifically to frame Moldova as a party to the broader conflict and to undermine its EU accession process. But despite all these efforts, the outcome turned out to be the exact opposite of what the Kremlin wanted. Sandu won her election, and her party retained its parliamentary majority. Support for EU membership rose instead of falling. Russia's estimated $350 million disinformation campaign simply wasn't enough to change the direction the Moldovan people had already chosen. Every single intervention attempt exposed Russia's true intentions and pushed its intended target even faster toward the west. Let's pause here for a moment, because there's still a genuine physical fault line sitting on the map that deserves real attention. If you're finding this breakdown useful so far, drop a comment telling me whether you think Transnistria eventually resolves peacefully or becomes a genuine flashpoint, and make sure you're subscribed because what comes next covers exactly why this narrow strip of land matters so much to the entire region. Transnistria. This narrow strip of land along the eastern bank of the Dniester River feels like a place where time simply stopped moving. Lenin statues still stand in the streets, hammer and sickle symbols decorate buildings. Soviet aesthetics cover nearly every corner. The region split from Moldova back in 1992 after a brief war, and it's continued existing ever since as a so-called state, internationally unrecognized, but functionally under Russian control. Roughly 1,500 Russian soldiers remain stationed there under the label of a peacekeeping force. In the village of Kabasna sits one of Europe's most dangerous inherited liabilities, a massive ammunition depot containing 20,000 tons of Soviet-era munitions, just 2 kilometers from the Ukrainian border and 200 kilometers from the border with NATO member Romania. The last international inspection of this depot took place back in 2007. For more than 15 years now, neither the OSCE nor any other international organization has been allowed inside. The shelf life of this ammunition expired long ago, and experts warn that an accidental or deliberate explosion could trigger a genuine regional disaster. Russia systematically rejects every inspection request, because this depot provides the exact justification needed to keep soldiers stationed in the region indefinitely. Putin clearly has no intention of giving up this leverage voluntarily. In 2026, he signed a decree specifically making it easier for residents of Transnistria to obtain fast-tracked Russian citizenship. Sandu openly called this exactly what it looks like, an attempt at recruitment. According to Sandu, most young people in Transnistria are actually crossing over to the Moldovan-controlled side of the country, out of genuine fear they'll otherwise be sent to fight in Russia's war. They don't want any part of what she called this insane war. Moldova's overall strategy toward Transnistria isn't military, it's economic. Russia's decision to cut gas supplies in the middle of winter paradoxically strengthened Moldova's position because Transnistria itself was hit by that same disruption, and residents there quickly realized they simply couldn't rely on Russia either. The number of people crossing into Moldovan-controlled territory specifically to find work has been steadily increasing. Chisinau is applying sustained economic pressure on the separatist regime, working to eventually replace it with international administration instead. So can Moldova actually join the EU without fully resolving the Transnistria situation first? The EU's Enlargement Commissioner addressed this directly back in February 2025. Moldova's future would never be held hostage by this frozen conflict in Transnistria, and there's genuine precedent here. Cyprus joined the EU back in 2004, while its northern territory remained under Turkish military control, entirely unresolved at the time. Moldova could apply that exact same formula, full EU membership, with EU legislation temporarily suspended specifically within Transnistria until the situation resolves. And here's the genuinely ironic part. Transnistria is already economically dependent on the EU. 71% of the region's exports go directly to the EU market, thanks to Moldova's existing selling to Russia. It's selling to Europe. On top of that, Ukrainian forces have effectively cut off Russia's land connection to Transnistria entirely. Without meaningful outside support, this breakaway region simply cannot sustain itself much longer. If Moldova eventually joins the European Union, 1,500 Russian soldiers and 20,000 tons of munitions would effectively be sitting on EU territory. Russia would then face a stark choice, either withdraw its soldiers or enter into direct tension with the European Union itself. Some French diplomats are already voicing concern, suggesting Transnistria could become a genuine backdoor for Russian intelligence operations conducted right inside the EU's own borders. Both potential outcomes represent a genuine nightmare for the Kremlin, but a real opportunity for Moldova. Think for a moment about how strange this situation genuinely is from Moscow's perspective. Russia spent decades treating this ammunition depot and this small garrison as a permanent lever, a quiet reminder to Chisinau that Moscow could always apply pressure whenever it wanted. But that same leverage is quietly turning into a liability. A depot full of expired munitions that nobody has inspected in almost 2 decades isn't just a bargaining chip anymore. It's a genuine safety hazard sitting increasingly close to European Union territory, one that grows more embarrassing and more dangerous the longer Russia refuses outside inspection. What was designed as a tool of control is steadily becoming a symbol of exactly how little control Russia actually retains here. And this particular nightmare isn't limited to Moldova alone, because Moldova joining the European Union would trigger a genuine domino effect. Putin's broader vision of a Russian world has been systematically unraveling over these past several years. Ukraine represented the first major defeat of this doctrine, The country Russia tried hardest to pull back into its orbit is instead resisting fiercely on the battlefield and binding itself ever more tightly to the West. Moldova would represent the Kremlin, never fired a single weapon here. It tried to win entirely through hybrid tactics, and it lost anyway. This failure cost the Kremlin far more than just Moldova itself. It cost Russia its underlying assumption that hybrid warfare actually works as an effective strategy. And Armenia currently sits right on the edge of becoming a third defeat. Prime Minister Pashinyan launched a sharp pivot toward the West after Russia's betrayal during the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Armenia joined the International Criminal Court, effectively distanced itself from the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, and opened new security dialogues with both the United States and France. Shore's own attempt to interfere in Armenian elections failed outright. The Kremlin's hybrid tools collapsed there too. Georgia's situation is more complicated. Its government remains close to Russia, but its public keeps taking to the streets demanding EU membership, and social pressure continues building steadily. Even in Central Asia, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have started quietly distancing themselves from Russia, shifting toward Moscow's traditional dominance over what it still calls its near abroad. Looking at the bigger picture, Russia's sphere of influence across the former Soviet geography isn't just shrinking anymore, it's genuinely collapsing. Moldova stands as the clearest symbol of this broader collapse. The smallest, poorest, and most seemingly defenseless former Soviet republic turned decisively toward the West, despite every pressure tactic Russia threw at it, and it hasn't looked back since. If Moldova can pull this off, other countries can too, and the Kremlin knows exactly that. But Moldova's road forward isn't entirely straight either, and ignoring the remaining obstacles would make for an incomplete analysis. The EU membership process takes years, and Moldova's stated 2030 target is considered genuinely ambitious by many experts who study these accession timelines closely. Completing negotiations across 35 distinct policy areas requires an enormous institutional transformation for the poorest country in Europe. Judicial independence and anti-corruption reforms represent the areas the EU is watching most closely, and given Moldova's troubled past with exactly these issues, they remain particularly challenging to fully resolve. Reforms are progressing, but the real question is whether the pace is genuinely fast enough. There are also challenges within the European Union itself. Enlargement fatigue is a genuine documented phenomenon. Not every EU member state wants Moldova to become a full member immediately. Budget negotiations among existing members are already tense enough without adding new recipients of structural funds to the mix, and some governments quietly worry about setting a precedent that speeds up other pending candidacies before their own populations are ready to accept them. The unification option carries its own complications too. Only about 14.5% of Moldova's ethnic minorities currently support unification with Romania. The autonomous status of Gagauzia, along with Transnistria's structure involving 3 official languages, could potentially trigger a genuine constitutional crisis. Merging the legal systems, economies, and governance structures of 2 separate countries represents an enormous undertaking on its own, and Russia clearly considers full unification a genuine red line. The Kremlin's hybrid tools may be exhausted at this point, but its capacity for provocation hasn't disappeared entirely. Cyber attacks, escalation through Transnistria, and fresh disinformation campaigns all remain very real possibilities still on the table. There's one more risk worth mentioning too: dependency on individual leadership. Moldova's overall Western orientation rests heavily on President Sandu's personal determination and vision. Will that same orientation continue with equal determination once her time in office eventually ends? Are Moldova's institutions genuinely strong enough on their own, or does this entire process still rest primarily on the shoulders of one leader? Moldova's opposition, particularly the Socialist Party led by former President Igor Dodon, continues actively pushing a pro-Russian agenda, and election dynamics can always shift unexpectedly. A single close election, a well-funded disinformation push at exactly the right moment, or genuine economic hardship during a difficult winter could all still shift public sentiment more than anyone expects today. But despite all these genuine obstacles, the fundamental underlying question doesn't really change. What's the actual alternative here? Returning to Russia's embrace simply isn't an option anymore. The Moldovan people have already rejected that path clearly and decisively. Reforms may be moving slowly, but they haven't stopped. With every passing day, Moldova becomes a little more integrated with the West through passports, energy independence, trade relationships, and defense cooperation. The process isn't perfect, but the direction is unmistakably clear, and changing that direction now would genuinely be harder for Moldova than continuing forward toward the West. It's worth remembering just how unlikely this entire trajectory would have seemed only a decade ago. This is a country that lost $1 billion to bank fraud in a single year, watched a quarter of its working population leave in search of better lives elsewhere, and endured winters where its own gas supply depended entirely on the goodwill of a neighbor actively trying to punish it. Countries in that position don't typically end up negotiating EU accession chapters on judicial independence and anti-corruption within a decade. Yet here, Moldova is doing exactly that, largely because every attempt to keep it compliant through fear and dependency eventually pushed it further in the opposite direction. Think about what this really represents when you step back from all the individual details. For years, Russia tried to control Moldova purely through fear, cutting off gas in winter, funneling dark money into elections, flooding television screens with propaganda, threatening the country with instability whenever it stepped even slightly out of line. And for a while, that approach worked well enough to keep Moldova cautious and hesitant. But fear has a shelf life too, much like the expired ammunition sitting in that Kabazna depot. It doesn't work indefinitely, especially once the other side simply stops being afraid. Moldova stopped being afraid. And that's really the deepest problem facing the Kremlin right now. It's not simply the country Russia is losing here. It's the fear Russia is losing along with it. The psychological leverage that once made smaller neighbors think twice before turning toward Europe. Once that fear disappears in one place, it becomes measurably harder to maintain anywhere else nearby. Georgia's protesters are watching. Armenia's government is watching. Even parts of Central Asia are watching quietly from a distance. Every time a small, vulnerable country calls Moscow's bluff and survives the consequences, it becomes a little easier for the next country to consider doing the same thing. So here's the question genuinely worth sitting with as this story keeps developing. If the poorest, smallest, and supposedly most vulnerable former Soviet republic can walk this path successfully despite everything Moscow threw at it, what does that actually mean for every other country still sitting in Russia's shrinking shadow, wondering whether it's finally safe to make the same choice? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If this breakdown helped you understand exactly why Moldova matters so much more than its size suggests, hit like, share it with someone following Eastern European politics closely, and subscribe, because this story is far from finished, and what happens next in Moldova could reshape the entire region.